Clint Eastwood walked into his own restaurant unnoticed until he heard a waitress crying, and what happened next left the entire room silent. The night was winding down in Carmel by the Sea, a town where faces were familiar and strangers rarely went unnoticed. The glow from the streetlights cast long shadows along the sidewalk, stretching toward the entrance of Mission Ranch, a modest yet beloved restaurant with history, charm, and, most importantly, Clint Eastwood's name above the door. But tonight, there were no flashing cameras or hushed whispers about Hollywood royalty. No one expected him to be there. At 94, Clint Eastwood still carried himself with quiet authority, a presence that could shift the air in a room without a word. He had always valued hard work and respect, and though he hadn't planned on stopping by the restaurant tonight, an impulse led him there, an old habit of checking in, seeing things as they were when no one knew he was watching. As he stepped inside, the familiar atmosphere wrapped around him, the soft clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations, and the low hum of a piano drifting in the background. From the corner, the scent of sizzling steak and fresh sourdough. Bread filled the air, blending with the faint saltiness of the ocean beyond the windows. The restaurant was full, but not chaotic, just the right level of energy for a late evening crowd. Clint didn't announce his presence. There was no grand entrance, no clearing of throats or shifting glances. Dressed in a well-worn jacket and dark slacks, he moved with an ease that allowed him to disappear into the background, just another old-timer looking for a quiet seat. But then something stopped him cold. A sound, soft, but unmistakable. It wasn't the usual clatter of a busy restaurant or the occasional raised voice of a lively guest. It was something far more out of place, a muffled sob. His gaze sharpened as he turned slightly, following the sound to the far side of the dining area, just beyond the swinging doors to the kitchen. Near the service station, half hidden by a partition, stood a young waitress. She had her back to the room, her hands gripping the counter, her shoulders trembling as she took deep, uneven breaths, trying to pull herself together. She was crying, but she wasn't making a scene. She wasn't seeking attention. In fact, she was trying desperately not to be noticed. But Clint had noticed. He lingered for a moment, watching as she quickly wiped her face, inhaled sharply, and straightened up, a mask of forced composure slipping into place, the kind worn by someone who had swallowed their pride too many times. Something about it didn't sit right with him. He wasn't the type to pry into every little problem. Life had its share of troubles, and people handled them in their own way. But the way she shrank into herself, the slight tremble in her hands, just before she turned to re-enter the dining room, it wasn't just frustration, it was hurt. Still unnoticed, Clint shifted his weight. He could have ignored it, taken a quiet seat in the back, and let the night go on as usual. But that wasn't his way. His instincts told him there was more to this, and when Clint Eastwood got that feeling, he didn't just walk away. Before he could act, he caught a hushed conversation between two nearby employees, words that made the pieces start falling into place. He remained still, sharp eyes fixed on the waitress as she hurried toward the kitchen doors, her face turned away from the crowd. She wasn't just upset, she was trying to disappear, and Clint wasn't the only one who noticed. Near the bar, a busboy and another waitress stood close, their conversation hushed but urgent. Clint wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but in a room like this, where voices blended into the ambient hum, certain words had a way of cutting through the noise. "That guy's been on her case all night," the young man muttered, shaking his head. "I know, she's new too. Just started last month," the waitress whispered back. "It's disgusting and nobody's saying a damn thing." Clint's jaw tightened slightly. Nobody's saying a damn thing. His gaze shifted toward the dining room, scanning the tables, searching for the source of the problem. Mission Ranch. wasn't a fancy white tablecloth kind of place. It had character, a rustic warmth that made people feel at home. But there were always a few customers who mistook good service for servitude, the kind who thought a tip gave them the right to demean the person bringing their food. And then Clint saw him. A middle-aged man, maybe late 50s, sat at a corner table, lounging like he owned the place. His blazer was unbuttoned, his tie loosened, and his laughter cut through the room like a blade. The man's laughter rang out, far, louder than necessary, filling the air with a forced confidence that made the moment feel even uglier. The people at his table, 2 men and a woman, seemed entertained, though not entirely at ease. The woman glanced toward the kitchen doors, her expression unreadable. The waitress was no longer at their table, but the way they carried on told Clint everything he needed to know. This wasn't just a bad tipper. This was a man who enjoyed making people uncomfortable, the kind Clint had spent a lifetime despising. His hands slid into his pockets as he turned toward the kitchen. He didn't need to guess what had happened. He already knew. The details would come soon enough, but right now only one thing was on his mind. The waitress was in the back, crying, and Clint Eastwood wasn't about to let that stand. But just as he was about to move, he saw her step back onto the floor. Her shoulders were squared, her face composed, as if nothing had happened. Clint watched as she moved through the dining area with careful precision, like someone walking on broken glass. Her hands were steady, her expression unreadable, but her eyes carried a weight no one should have to bear during a shift. She wove through the tables, tray balanced on one arm, stopping just short of. At the loud man's table, Clint noticed the subtle shift in the waitress, how her posture stiffened, how she inhaled a deep breath like she was bracing for impact. The man didn't acknowledge her at first, too caught up in his own exaggerated story, waving a hand in the air as his companions offered half-hearted smiles, half-endured his performance. But the moment he turned and saw her standing there, a slow smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Ah, look who's back," he drawled, leaning back in his chair. The woman at the table looked away. One of the men suddenly found his watch fascinating. Silent bystanders who had heard every word but decided it was easier to pretend they hadn't. "You forget how to do your job, sweetheart?" the man continued, taking a slow sip of his drink. The waitress didn't flinch. She simply set a fresh glass of water in front of him. "There you go, sir," she said quietly. "Oh, so now you're polite," he laughed, shaking his head before turning to his friends. "See? All it takes is a little coaching. You push them enough and they figure it out." The waitress gripped her tray a little tighter. Not a single person at the table told him to stop. Clint had seen a lot in his lifetime, good men, bad men, and cowards who let bad men do as they pleased. And this, right here, was exactly the kind of thing that got under his skin. But it wasn't over. The man wasn't satisfied with humiliating her once. He picked up his fork, inspected his plate, and clicked his tongue. "You know what? I think you got my order wrong." The waitress blinked. "I'm sorry, sir. You asked for the ribeye, medium—" No, he interrupted, shaking his head dramatically. "I said medium rare. See, this is what I mean. You just don't listen, do you?" Clint could see the girl wasn't confused. She knew exactly what was happening. She was cornered. "Would you like me to have the kitchen fix it?" she asked, her voice calm and measured. "Oh, so now I gotta wait another half hour? I swear, service these days." He leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to make it personal. "Maybe if you weren't so busy running your mouth, you'd be better at your job." That was when she cracked, not visibly, not dramatically, but Clint caught it. A barely there hesitation. The slight tightening of her jaw before she turned away. The way she slipped behind the kitchen doors like she couldn't get out fast enough. That's where he'd found her minutes ago, holding herself together just enough to keep from breaking. Clint had heard enough, but before he could move, the waitress reappeared, walking straight toward the table. No tears, no hesitation, just a quiet determination that told Clint she was ready for round two. But Clint had seen enough. He wasn't the kind to interfere in every little dispute. But this wasn't just a bad customer. This was a man who believed power came from making others feel small, and that didn't sit right with him. Rising from his chair, he moved slowly, deliberately. No one had recognized him yet, and he intended to keep it that way, for now. His steps were silent against the wooden floor, but there was weight behind them. At the table, the waitress stood stiffly as the man smirked up at her. "Took you long enough," he muttered, swirling his drink. "What? You go cry in the back before coming out here?" Clint saw the slight tremor in the girl's fingers as she set down the replacement plate. Then, just as she turned to step away, the man reached, not aggressively, not forcefully, just enough. A hand hovered near her wrist, a move so subtle it could be excused as an accident if called out. She flinched. That was it. Clint's voice cut through the air like a blade. "That's enough." It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. The entire restaurant seemed to still in an instant. The man froze mid-smirk, confused at first. Slowly, he turned his head, eyes landing on Clint, just another old-timer in a plain jacket. "And who the hell are you?" The man scoffed, chuckling, as he leaned back. "Got yourself a little hero complex, pal?" Clint didn't blink. He didn't move. He didn't have to. "No," he said, his voice steady. "Just a man who doesn't like bullies." The laughter at the table died. The waitress took a step back, pressing the tray against her chest. She didn't speak, didn't move, like she couldn't believe what was happening. The man's smirk faltered for half a second before coming back, forced this time. "You serious? Over a waitress?" he sneered. "You got no idea what you're talking about, old man." Clint tilted his head slightly, studying him. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," he said. "I watched you run your mouth. All night, saw you humiliate someone just trying to do their job, and now you're sitting there thinking you're untouchable." The man shook his head, scoffing. "You got some nerve." Clint took a step closer. "No," he interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. "You do." The air in the room changed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it was final. The man opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time that night, he looked uneasy. His eyes darted around, suddenly aware that everyone was watching. The waitress wasn't alone anymore, and neither was Clint. But before the man could decide whether to fight back or back down, one of his own dinner guests shifted uncomfortably in their seat, and the tension at the table cracked just enough to make him think twice. The table cracked for a brief moment. The man looked around as if expecting someone, anyone, to step in and break the tension, but no one did. The restaurant had gone eerily quiet. Every conversation stalled, every fork paused mid-air. His friends at the table weren't laughing anymore. The woman shifted in her seat, eyes darting between him and Clint. One of the men cleared his throat and reached for his drink, suddenly finding the bottom of his glass more interesting than the scene unfolding before him. The man straightened, rolling his shoulders as if that might shake the unease creeping up his spine. His bravado was slipping, but he wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. "You got a problem, old man?" he asked, his voice lower now. Clint didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, his gaze steady, unwavering. The weight of that stare, the kind that had unsettled far tougher men in his lifetime, seemed to land squarely on the man's chest. His fingers drummed once against the table before he scoffed and leaned back, forcing out a chuckle. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, shaking his head. "All this over some—" Clint took another step forward. Just one. Careful. The warning landed like a hammer, a single word carrying more weight than any threat could. The man's mouth snapped shut, and for the first time all night he looked uncertain. Clint didn't need to raise his voice or posture. His presence alone was enough. The man exhaled sharply, his eyes flicking toward his friends as if searching for support, but none came. The woman at the table looked embarrassed for him, while the other man shifted uncomfortably and muttered, "Let's just eat." That was it. The shift, the moment of recognition. The man might have been arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. He could feel it, the way the air had turned against him. He wasn't in control anymore. Letting out a forced chuckle, he reached for his drink. Whatever, not worth the damn trouble. But Clint wasn't done. "Apologize," he said flatly. The man nearly choked on his drink. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Clint replied, his voice steady, unwavering. "You spent your night tearing her down. Now you're going to look her in the eye and apologize." The man let out another laugh, but this time it was weaker. The kind of laugh someone gives when they know they've already lost. The waitress barely breathed as the man shifted, tapping his fingers against the table, his eyes flicking between Clint and the others around him, realizing he had no way out. Finally, he exhaled sharply, not out of remorse, but resignation. "Fine," he muttered, barely looking at her. "Sorry." Clint didn't move. The waitress swallowed hard, standing tall despite the exhaustion and humiliation written in her posture. "That's not an apology," Clint said. The man's jaw clenched, silence stretching between them before he finally lifted his gaze. "I'm sorry," he said, slower this time, and for the first time tonight he meant it. Clint held his gaze a second longer before stepping back, and the restaurant seemed to exhale at once, conversations resuming in hushed murmurs. It wouldn't go back to normal, not completely. As Clint turned to leave, the waitress hesitated, gripping her tray like an anchor, her eyes meeting his, still heavy with the night's weight, but now holding something else, a quiet strength. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. Clint gave a small nod, barely more than a shift of his head. He didn't need thanks. This wasn't about him. The man at the table, still brooding, exhaled sharply, muttering under his breath. As his untouched meal sat before him, his appetite soured by his own actions. His companions, once complicit in their silence, now sat uncomfortably, their unease lingering like smoke after a fire. The restaurant manager, a wiry man in his 50s, finally appeared, his eyes darting between Clint and the tension still hanging in the air. He opened his mouth to speak, but Clint turned to the waitress first. "You good?" he asked, his voice low. She hesitated for a brief moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I am." That was enough for him. He turned to leave, but the manager stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. Eastwood," Clint stopped, leveling him with a look that made the man rethink whatever corporate platitude he was about to say. Instead, the manager shifted his attention to the table. "We don't tolerate behavior like that in this restaurant," he said quickly. "That man should leave." The waitress stiffened, something flickering in her expression, frustration, defiance. She looked at the manager, then at the man who had humiliated her, and in that moment she made a decision. "No." She spoke, and the table went silent once more. Even Clint raised an eyebrow slightly. The man smirked, thinking she was backing down, but she wasn't. "He can stay," she continued, her voice steady. "But I won't be serving him." There was no hesitation, no doubt. She was drawing the line herself. The manager hesitated, then gave a nod. Understood. Clint watched the man at the table, catching the flicker of something, maybe shame, maybe just irritation at losing control of the situation. Either way, it wasn't Clint's concern anymore. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his wallet, and placed a crisp $100 bill on the counter. Not as charity, but as recognition for good service. "Well earned," he said simply. The waitress swallowed hard, but gave him a small nod. With that, Clint turned and headed for the door. The cool night air greeted him as he stepped onto the sidewalk. He hadn't come here looking for trouble, he never did. But sometimes, trouble found the wrong person. And when that happened, Clint Eastwood made damn sure it didn't go unanswered. Life is full of people who think power comes from putting others down, but real strength is in standing up, even when no one else does.